Well, ladies and gentlemen, I consider it a high honor to be invited to this very moving occasion where we pay homage to the victims of the Holocaust and examine the message it has for us, not only as citizens, but as physicians. I also want to mention in passing that it's very moving to me to come back to this institution. I have long connections dating back to Dr. Michael John's chairmanship of the department. I visited the department on a number of occasions as a guest of Dr. Schreier, and it's moving to have many of former students and house officers meeting here in this occasion. Now, what I'd like to do this morning is to examine certain features in the following fashion. I will present some modest experiences I've had with Nazi physicians who were on trial in Dachau. Then I want to say something about medical ethics in general. Third, I'd like to talk about the Holocaust, independent of medicine, indicating what the Holocaust it was and why it's such a unique feature, different from other persecutions that have afflicted mankind. And finally, I want to address the very interesting question posed in the brochure, namely, what is the message of the Holocaust for medicine? What significance does it have for medicine? So let me begin by presenting some experiences that I had in Germany. Now, you may remember that during the Second World War, if you wanted to stay in medical school, you had to be in the army. You were a member of the military corps. I was in the army that time, and I can hardly see the slide. It's meant to show me as evidence of army service, but I can't identify myself from this point of view. So I'll go on to the next slide, which is in Dachau. Now, the circumstances of this slide and my participation here devolves about the fact that a Nazi officer was on trial in Dachau for being somehow associated with the death of 40 patients following liver biopsy. Now, the trial had been going on for several months before I arrived on the scene, and it had been established that this was the officer who conducted the studies, and he was the one who was associated with the death of these 40 patients. I was asked to appear before the court. This is a military court. 3 generals were in charge of the court. And I was asked to testify regarding the indications for liver biopsy as a medical procedure that might have therapeutic value. If it could be shown or argued that liver biopsy, however tragic its outcome in these circumstances, was nevertheless a procedure that was legitimate and might lead to medical betterment, this would be considered in the sentence and lighten it somewhat. But if the liver biopsy had no significance in terms of therapeutic implications, then of course the sentence would be that much more severe. Now here am I testifying or swearing before the court. As I say, there were 3 generals in a court. The Nazi officer had been offered a lawyer, but he refused, acting as his own counsel. Next slide, please. Now, here he is. He was a handsome man, very well educated, had had a fellowship at the Rockefeller Institute before the war, spoke flawless English, and argued with great lucidity. Now, the first episodes of the court involved his challenging my expert status. The idea was that he would discredit me as an expert witness, and so he posed a series of questions which centered on methods, liver-function methods. How do we do a bromsulfonate? How do we do a Keflin flocculation? How do we fractionate the plasma proteins? The idea here was to discredit my expert status. And of course, you know that most physicians would not have at their fingertips how to do the chemical tests involved in liver function studies. Fortuitously, the book he used, which was right before him, was Peters and Van Slyke. And I had trained with Dr. Peters, and he forced us to go through all the methods of the laboratory before we were allowed to pursue a research project. So in this anomalous circumstance, it turns out that I had these methods on my fingertips, and in addition, I had set up the laboratory in Munich before I assumed responsibilities on the medical service. So after about a day of questioning, the court decided that at least with this challenge of expert witness, I could qualify, and they went on to other things. The officer asked me what I knew about liver biopsies in Germany, in France, Holland, say Poland, in 1943, and I had to admit that I knew nothing. There was no communication. We had no information. So he asked how it came to pass that I could qualify in making pronouncements about liver biopsy when I knew nothing about liver biopsy as they were conducted in these West European countries. And I indicated that while it's true that I did not know anything directly, one could make certain reasonable inferences. Liver biopsy had been developed in the United States by Koch in Chicago. The Americans were way ahead of all aspects of liver biopsy. Moreover, on the table was lying a needle, and I pointed out that it was a modification of the Wim Silverman needle, which was used for liver biopsy and was an American needle. So if you accept the assumption that the American experience was in the forefront of liver biopsy, one can then draw the inference that there was no evidence that liver biopsy had therapeutic implications of benefit to the patient. So the argument went along these lines, and finally the court decided that liver biopsy was not an indication for the guidance of therapy, that it could be done for research, but on the other hand, these were not research procedures. There were no informed consent or anything like that, and that the conclusion was drawn that liver biopsy was a form of torture, and the officer was sentenced appropriately. Now, this is all I wish to say about my own experience directly with a German officer, but there are certain features that I would like to point out. This is a very well-educated physician, trained in the best of places, including those in the United States. He was a very sophisticated man. This was not someone who was limping along with minor education. He had the benefits of the best education elsewhere. He was a confirmed Nazi in every way. And he was a proponent of the most vicious types of Nazi ideology. Yet this was an individual who was well-educated, well thought of, a member of the medical profession, a dignified person by certain criteria, by other criteria, a monster. Now, I want to examine some of the implications that a command society has on people. Educated people often, but uneducated people as well. How it constrains their range of thinking and how it corrupts their thought. I want to start by saying something about medical ethics to begin with. May I have the next slide, please? Now, when we consider life, we may consider 3 or 4 different ways of defining living systems. There is, for example, biochemical life, the intact functioning of a cell. And there are various criteria by which we can distinguish living from non-living systems. This was the great embryologic problem of the late 19th century. Now we have vegetative life, where we have the mere functioning and survival of organ systems, the consequence of the cardiorespiratory advances which can keep an organism alive even though central nervous system functions are gone. And then we have human life, which is the interrelationship and intentionality with the full portrayal of choice, of dignity, of interrelationships. Now, it's human life we're interested in, ultimately, in this connection. It's interesting, nevertheless, that some of the greatest discoveries that influence the character of human life originate from studies at this level. Nevertheless, ultimately, our interest is in a full panorama of human experience. Next slide, please. Now, one has to ask what properties one would look at in individuals who enjoy, let's say, the full dignity of a human being. And 4 general principles have been identified which serve to characterize our interactions with each other, how we intrude or interact with other human beings. First, there is autonomy, the right of individuals to believe and act as they choose, independent of the will of others. Beneficence, the duty to promote and confer benefits. Non-maleficence, do no harm. And finally, justice, the requirements that persons should receive what they more or less deserve in fairness. Next slide, please. Now, what is the status of these moral values? There is a considerable argument about this, especially today in Africa. You remember that there are certain African tribes which mutilate women in sexual ways. And when Western society say you shouldn't do that, that's mean, that's inhumane, they say, don't impose your values on us. Don't superimpose Western values on us. We're old societies. We've been doing this for 1,000 years. These things are built into our religious structure. Don't superimpose Western views on our social system. Not all things are as dramatic as the sexual mutilation business. There are all sorts of behavior patterns. We see this by the Bush administration wishing to establish, let us say, democracies in societies where they're not cordial, seemingly a noble part. And yet these societies turn around and say, Don't intrude on Western values. We have our own value structures. Don't be so righteous. Don't think you have a monopoly on truth and goodness. Next slide, please. However, we may say that moral values are objective. That is, impartial rationality undergirds universal standards. What is rational for one person is equally rational for the rest of us in the same circumstances. Now, this argues that the values that I've talked about are not unique to Western society. These, in some sense, stem from the circumstance of being a human being. And in this sense, they apply to everyone. So one would try to argue that the values I listed earlier are not uniquely an expression of Western political structures. Rather, they stem from the fact that human beings, in their interaction in a civilized way with each other, have certain objective properties which are undergirded by impartial, rational judgments. Next slide, please. Now, the property that is very precious in all this discussion is the issue of autonomy. Now, autonomy was developed first by the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant in the Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals. It's interesting, it's German. And in Kant's view, a very moving view, he asserted two categorical imperatives. They say, act only according to the maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. That says that if you do something to someone else, you should assume that the same sort of thing is legitimately inflicted on you. Don't impose on other people standards that you yourself would not execute. Be honest. There should be a universal application to everyone equally. And the second categorical imperative is that act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, always as an end and not as a means. In other words, you don't treat people instrumentally. You treat them as ends in themselves. And the implication is that the moral autonomy of every human being is expressed in self-rule and independence of the will of others. Next slide, please. Now, this was carried further by John Stuart Mill in his great essay on liberty. I won't go through the whole thing from you, but Mill reiterates in a very moving passage, the only legitimate limitation on an individual's liberty is the prevention of harm to others. In his own person or her own person, an individual is of right autonomous, anti-paternalism, interference with a person's liberty by society or its members for the person's own good is never justifiable. This is an exaltation of the dignity of an individual human being in allowing him or her to execute their lives as they wish, short of harming other people. It is a tribute to the fact that we want to tolerate strangers, that we want to tolerate anomalous behavior. We owe something less than everything to outsiders who are often better than us. This is a plea for tolerance. Next slide, please. Now, these features, these principles of ethics, have been built into medicine. And we assume that now autonomy is released by informed consent. If that is interpreted in a dignified way, we say that we want patients to understand what they are being advised for, that they should understand it and be able to exercise choice. And now these other moral principles flow along with this. Next slide, please. So medicine, we can say, has a kind of priestly function with sympathetic care by a physician in a partnership, we would say now, not a paternalistic relationship with the patient. And it applies to patients the scientific base, that is the application of the tested knowledge incorporated in medical science for the relief of pain, disability, and death. Okay, so these are certain standards. We sometimes fail to obviously live up to the fullest extent of their commands. Nevertheless, these are certain standards that should animate the physician in the course of his or her procedures. Next slide, please. Now, I want to drop this for the moment and turn to the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust is a unique phenomenon in human experience. It is not simply the murder of people or the torture of people. It is an identification of certain segments of the population who, in Hitler's words, have no right to exist. This is not an instrumental statement. For example, we torture or we intimidate prisoners in the United States. Sometimes many people think these procedures are actual torture. And people have said, that's like the Holocaust. It's not like the Holocaust. I'm not justifying anything of this, but it is instrumental. It is done to get information. The Holocaust is unprecedented in human experience because it was designed to obliterate a people for no other purpose than that they had no right to exist. It wasn't to get more information, it wasn't to get property, although property did flow from it. It was designed to destroy a contamination of the Herrenvolk. It stemmed from a theory, a view of the German hierarchy, especially Hitler and the circle around him, that there was a pure Herrenvolk and that the contamination of this blood, the term Blut, has a special meaning in Germany, which made it inaccessible for medical use, as the poet Enzensberger pointed out. You cannot contaminate the sacred blood. And so there was a systematic policy to obliterate this entire Jewish population. And this kind of activity was distinct from almost any other kind of persecution one could imagine. It wasn't a question of enemies, it wasn't a question of money, it wasn't a question of property, it wasn't a question of information. Now, the Nazi racial ideology involved a hierarchy of people. The Aryans were the superior race, the Herrenvolk. The Jews were the racial arch foe destined for extermination, just because they were Jews, not for anything that was done, just because they were Jews. The Slavs were racial inferiors, they were destined to be slaves. And the Gypsies were antisocial people, they didn't care about them whatsoever. Next slide, please. Now, Hitler regarded the Jewish question as a political problem, and the mass annihilation of Jews was part of the Operation Barbarossa. To subjugate the Jews, the destruction of Jews was equal in importance to the conquest of Poland and Russia. Now, we come here now to the penetration of the Germans into Eastern Europe. Now, there is a German theory which antedated Hitler called the Drang nach Osten, the penetration to the east for territory, for land, for agricultural and other purposes. And there are, next slide please, a series of German philosophers and historians, of whom a very well-known and very highly respected German theorist, Götz Ali, has developed the notion that the main purpose of the German penetration east was to obtain land, and that the Jews were exterminated in this process as a secondary and passive consequence of the penetration east. What he is saying is that Hitler was an extreme example of, so to speak, an ordinary European political view. This is false. The Holocaust was perpetrated as an autonomous activity designed to obliterate the Jewish population. And it was done at great cost, so to speak. The railroads, there was no railroad, there was no funding for taking Jews to Auschwitz, for example. They had to compete with army trains at a time when the German army was in desperate straits. The execution of the Jews was not limited to Eastern Europe. It went on in Germany itself, it went on in France, and we know from the studies principally of American historians and sociologists that the French were detestable, many parts of them. It went on in Holland. None of these were Eastern Europe. The obliteration was universal in Europe. Everywhere the Nazis could extend their power. Next slide, please. Well, here I want to I want to summarize some of the features of a historian of the Holocaust who compares the destruction of the European Jews, to use Hilberg's phrase, with other destructive processes with which it has been analogized. For example, the indiscriminate bombing of Hamburg and Dresden. Terrible. No one denies it. It has nothing to do with the Holocaust. That was instrumental. It may have been unwise, but it was designed to end the war. The Holocaust was not designed for any external purpose. It was designed to destroy a population relentlessly because of what they were, and no other purpose. The Dresden bombings, they were in retaliation for the V2 attacks. Maybe that was ill-considered. Maybe it shouldn't have been done. I'm not arguing either way of that, but that is fundamentally a different activity. The My Lai tragedies, where American troops destroyed civilian populations in the Vietnam War. This was done by motivating fear that civilians were actually members of the Viet Cong, were concealed enemies. Maybe they shouldn't have done this, but this was of a different order than killing people, not because they were enemies or threats, but because of what they were. Deaths of blacks in slums, abortions, sometimes in considering various things, we see an outgrowth of this in the present campaign in a shameful way, in my opinion, where there is an attempt to assimilate unattractive, vicious procedures to the Holocaust. It has nothing to do with the Holocaust. All of these instances are tragic instances which are of a different order. The Holocaust was unique. It was the Nazi view that there are certain peoples who should have no right to live. They should be obliterated because they are a danger to the Herrenvolk by contaminating the sacred blood. Next slide, please. Now, I've listed here in several slides, I think I'm going to go over them rapidly, the manner in which the Germans carried out the destruction of the European Jews. About 2 million Jews were killed in the concentration camps, the killing camps of Auschwitz and a number of others, Theresienstadt and so forth. But that wasn't the only way. There were Einsatzgruppen. That means troops in the SS who accompanied the German army as they penetrated into Eastern Europe, whose purpose was to round up Jewish citizens and kill them. Now, once again, this could be concealed, and was concealed, as if it were part of the military requirements in the war. But it wasn't. It was independent of that. It actually was a burden on the German army. Moreover, what is really ominous about all this, in addition, is that the army, the Prussian soldiers in the army, tried to dissociate themselves from the Holocaust. But this was false. Von Manstein, the great strategist who was responsible for the destruction of France, the great penetration through the Ardennes, brilliant strategist. We now have evidence of his orders to German troops to cooperate with and help the Einsatzgruppen in their assault on Jewish citizenry. Reichenau, General Reichenau, we have evidence that his communications also did that. So the German army, the Prussian army, which, whatever you want to say about it, was at least originally a military caste, independent of political implications, was totally corrupted. There were, to be sure, certain islands of resistance, but the major features of the German army, the Prussian aristocracy, was completely corrupted by the Nazi ideology. Next slide, please. Now, as I say, racial purity was the goal of Masselmore. It desired to maintain Aryan blood. Jews were to be exterminated, Slavs were to be subjugated. Next slide, please. Now, these are various ways, as I say. The concentration camps were one. The Einsatzgruppen that accompanied the German army, with very often the cooperation of the army itself, that is, the soldiers in the army, were ordered to gather up populations and execute them, often with the enthusiastic cooperation of the Polish population, the Hungarian, well, the Hungarians were a little better, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and whatnot. Next slide, please. Now, the Holocaust, the destruction of the European Jews then, as I say, was a true genocide. It was a unique phenomena. It is not a byproduct of war. It is not a consequence of indiscriminate battle casualties or bombing, not an expression of Nazi cruelty or expediency. These were intended by practical end of ensuring Nazi mastery of Europe. The Holocaust was an end in itself. It was based on the Jews, the judgment that Jews had no right to live. This makes the Holocaust unique, profoundly different from Hiroshima, My Lai, and Dresden. Next slide, please. Now, there was then a military war and an ideologic war, but these merged. And the sharp distinction that some recent German historians have wished to make has really collapsed as you view the documents which have come to pass about some of the orders that the troops received and their participation in the destruction of European Jews by the Einsatzgruppen. Next slide, please. Now I want to turn to medicine. I go through this analysis of the Holocaust because there is a very interesting question posed on the brochure. What is the message of the Holocaust to medicine? And I want to make clear that the Holocaust was a program of a coercive government, law, force, universal application, with the full power, military, political, and economic, of the government behind it. It was all pervasive. It was throughout German society. Every aspect of German society was under this order, so to speak, to round up, to confiscate, and ultimately to murder the European Jews in Germany, in other European countries, no less than in Eastern Europe. Now, the Nazi policy before the Second World War involved sterilization, euthanasia, and weird medical research. Now, I'm not going into this, but much of it is bizarre. Cutting off a leg, plunging it in water to see if you could stop the bleeding. Plunging someone in ice water to see how long they could live. All sorts of bizarre experiments, which were really forms of torture, were conducted by the Nazi medical profession. Experimental gangrene, hepatitis, infected wounds, immersion in ice water, explosive decompression, enhanced blood coagulation, all sorts of things like that were conducted by German physicians. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at medicine and recognize that the German physicians in general violated every aspect of the medical ethical principles that I enunciated at the beginning of this presentation, if you say that, you ask yourself, why were the German physicians vulnerable? Why didn't they uphold some of the standards of medicine? And here we have a famous statement of a historian of the Holocaust, arguing that all of this had nothing to do with medicine, that the behavior of the German physicians was an imposition of the German government, that the coercive forces of the German government were so powerful and so coercive and so vicious that most physicians were unable to resist, no matter what their ethical principles were, the power of a coercive government universally dispersed in the population. Next slide, please. And Davidova details how the Nazi experience had nothing to do with medicine. Their experiments, their work, so forth, was totally irrelevant. Next slide, please. Now, these are the principles of medical ethics that I mentioned earlier. Next slide. And they often are presented in isolation. And so when the National Commission, for example, concerned itself with medical ethics, these principles were developed and certain criteria were set forth to carry them out. Autonomy led to the development of IRBs. Informed consent was developed, and a variety of other principles, which I shan't go into in detail, were designed to carry these, or at least to try to expedite these in their application to patients. All this was done in an abstract theoretical way. I gave you Kant's and Mill's formulations of autonomy in the abstract, no context. Now take these principles and build them into the healthcare system. You say you want autonomy, but 57 million people are uninsured totally. Emergency rooms are underfunded. Many medical care patients won't be treated. And these are functions in large part of the healthcare system. They cannot be overturned by the individual dedication of a single physician very often on penalty of bankruptcy. Now, society at large has been ignored in the analysis of these principles. But consider the Nazi system. If you were a physician and you decided to treat patients, Jewish patients, in an appropriate fashion, you might be sent to prison, you might be killed, your family might be destroyed, and you might be intimidated by this. The chances are that most would be. Bonhoeffer was unusual. He allowed himself to be tortured. He allowed his family to be destroyed and didn't surrender a single principle of any nobility, but that's unique. People can't function that way. A society can't. And so one of the things you look at in the lesson of the Holocaust is that when a society becomes coercive, there's nothing to do with medicine, society at large, when it penetrates all aspects of the society in a coercive way, when it backs this up with soldiers, policemen, spies, and ruthless penetration everywhere, then these principles of medical ethics begin to fade. Now, next slide, please. I think that's the last one. So I want to say a word or two about the general theme of this symposium. What are the lessons of the Holocaust to medicine? Most of the recent treatments narrow it down to the behavior of physicians. And there is a famous article in the New England Journal by Alexander arguing that what led to the Holocaust, the causal roots of the medical transgressions, were the fact that German medicine was hierarchical. There was the hair professor, the this, the that, the other thing. Nonsense. The lesson of the Holocaust is that if you do not have a free society, this has nothing to do with medicine. If you do not have a reasonably free society, if the society becomes ruthless and coercive, if it penetrates into all aspects of life with massive coercion and colossal penalties, if living a decent life or executing a decent medical ethics becomes a cause for your own eradication, your family's eradication, then the principle of medical ethics fades. And it tells us, therefore, to my mind, the lesson of the Holocaust is support a free society. Support a decent democratic program. Be careful of vicious programs, no matter how isolated, which can become more generalized. Respect dignified human interrelationships. And under those circumstances, these principles of medicine can flourish. There are, to be sure, mean physicians as mean people generally. But under reasonable circumstances, these principles can exercise only if the society at large is reasonable. What the Holocaust tells us is that when a society develops programs akin to the Nazi programs, the exercise of medical dignity becomes impossible. It's not only medical dignity that disappears, all dignity disappears. Look at what happened to the German legal system. It went to pieces. Look what happened to the German aesthetic system. It went to pieces. You couldn't paint the painting. You couldn't write anything. All aspects of society became corrupted. The lesson of the Holocaust is support a free society. Be careful of encroachments on human liberty. Respect the dignity of individuals. Don't encourage vicious, secret, mean behavior which is concealed behind necessity. Try to err on the side of liberty, and then other values can express themselves. Thank you very much.